Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the mid-year update on State of Science. And I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. Today's presentation is really going to be made by myself and my colleague Jared Martinez, who's on the call with us. I want to make a shout out to some of the other folks at Linus who really played a huge role in this. One is Erin Legwold, who has been taking State of Science all the way through many of these years. She's just left to do a master's degree in business administration, so she won't be here with us, but we are continuing her legacy with this. Clarissa Maximo, as well as Lindsay Schott, who's actually doing a lot of review for us, and many of the other team members on Linus. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and we can go. We can keep going. So my name is Hamid Ghanadan. I'm the CEO and founder of Linus, and Jared Martinez is our strategist, and we are the two experts in the State of Science. We have 5 sections to really talk with you about. One is just to give you a quick executive summary about what we're learning and what's happening in life science. We'll share with you who we surveyed and what their sentiments are. We'll start by talking about macro dynamics in the space, and then do a deep dive on the economic outlook, talk about foresights for the remainder of 2025, and then some final thoughts as we're wrapping up. One last note here. So we're a pretty opinionated bunch here at Linus. We have lots and lots of opinions. However, we are not sharing our opinions with you. We're actually sharing the opinions and the views of our respondents. So nothing that we're saying here really necessarily represents the views of Linus or its team members. It is only a synthesis of what we heard from the people that we surveyed. What did we hear? Well, as is probably no surprise to any of you, there's lots of dynamics, geopolitical dynamics globally that are affecting us. And especially academics are being affected. And despite all of the headwinds and all the noise that we're hearing, actually, biopharma and pharma is staying fairly resilient and really forging ahead. And so while this sort of fear and budgetary and recessionary concerns are pretty rampant in the second half of 2025, and we'll share with you exact numbers on this, but when we dove deep, we realized that the vast majority of these are based on perception rather than tangible reality. So people are feeling a certain way, but they're doing something differently. And this is actually seen all over the world. We all feel this, where there's like our digital reality and then there's our tangible reality, and the two are very different discourses, and that's actually affecting life sciences in total. The bad news is that perception actually does drive people's action to some extent. So we'll talk about the nuances there. When thinking about what kind of technology people are really interested in the life sciences, AI is just undisputably at the top right now. Scientists overwhelmingly chose AI as the techniques that they're most interested in. But even more interestingly, that's not where their top spend is going to be. Sequencing techniques, and really, we think it's really multi-omic techniques that are really driving this, and that's at least amongst instrument purchases, that's going to be dominating. And then finally, many of you who are here are probably in some sort of a commercial role or have some sort of a commercial interest with your companies. And really what these are showing us, the data are showing us, and the scientists are telling us, is that there's going to be new rules. There's already new rules for engagement, commercial engagement. And so the tactics and the ways that we have been doing kind of opportunity generation and sales are just are so sort of wholesale not working anymore, that you all need to think about novel ways of establishing yourselves, creating trust, gaining insight, and then going into the market. So this is what we have to share with you today. As an introduction, for those of you who are new, the State of Science survey is something that we do semi-annually. And it's essentially our way of gauging consumer sentiment in life sciences. Consumer sentiments and consumer confidence drive a lot of prediction on how expenditure is going to happen in a particular market or in a particular economy. But there's no such a report or a metric for life sciences. So we decided that we were going to make one. And so we've been doing this. This is our 8th survey. So 4 years, we do it every half year. And we've engaged with a global cohort of scientists. These are people who came and answered surveys for us. And we asked them questions about how they're feeling, what they're most excited about, what their biggest barriers are, how they're planning on taking advantage of the opportunities or overcoming their barriers, how much money they expect to have, what their view is of the economy, and then what are they planning on spending money on. And so we synthesize all of that and we share it, the top line with our industry kind of as a gift twice a year. So this year, or for this survey, we surveyed 450 scientists. And they were from multiple geographies. They represent multiple organization types, application areas, and different levels of responsibility. Very importantly, we need you to know that the survey was taken between May 30th, which is when the survey opened, and June 22nd. So for all intents and purposes, it was through most of June that the data taking were taking place. So you can actually synthesize that with any kind of sort of news cycles that were happening at the time, which was actually relatively quiet. It was before any earnings were announced in our industry. It was also after all the tariff conversation had sort of died down, and so it was a good time to take a longer term pulse of our market. This year's cohort or this survey's cohort was split. You know, we do have overall representation, but the vast majority of our respondents were from North America, mainly US, 19% in Europe, or let's just say 20% in EMEA, and then 10% in Asia Pacific. Very, very large cohort of I believe people from China and India. And you know, from the perspective of how we're going to split this up, a lot of times we're going to talk about academia versus biopharma and pharma. And we just need you to know that academia represented half of our respondents. Biopharma represented almost a third of our respondents, as well as if you add contract, you know, CDMOs, CROs, and so on, plus non-therapeutic biotech, these are the industrial biotech organizations, manufacturing, hospital, and then other, which is a smattering of other techniques. All of the people who responded were scientists in a variety of different fields. They all verified that they use life science tools and services in their work, and that they're in some sort of a decision-making mode. So we have all of that information in the appendix of the survey, which we're not going to be walking through, but just for you to know that we have that level of detail. Okay, so now let's actually just give you a quick overview on the macro dynamics. This is basically how your customers are feeling and what they're thinking about. So no surprise to anyone, there's been a tremendous shift in political climate, especially in the US, but that's also reverberated around the world. I think around the world there's also a lot of political conversation that's dominating the discourse. And so we were expecting that public trust is going to decline in 2025. When we did our survey at the beginning of the year, it was right before that the US's current presidential administration had been inaugurated. So our data taking was prior to the inauguration of this current administration. And even then, there were some negative aspects that were being seen. But I think that no one was expecting the level with which this was going to take shape in our space. And so this is a key concern, and it translates to economic and funding concerns for our respondents. So just some key indicators here. Fully half of the scientists that responded to our survey expect public trust in science is going to go down in 2025. In fact, politicization of scientific topics is the #1 barrier to them actually moving their research forward. It's not reproducibility, it's not data, it's not the complexities of biology, it's politics. That's essentially what's top of mind for a lot of our respondents. More than half of our respondents, so 57%, believe that someone should step up and become a leader here and to actually start to communicate to the general public. It's sort of like they're looking for a grown-up in the room to stand up and really represent them. they don't feel like that they're the ones to do it, and that's really interesting. But they're begging someone to stand up and represent them well. And then also, just as far as the overall sentiment, for every one person who responded that they're motivated about the state of science in 2025, there were two people who said that they're feeling fearful. And so the number, so 28% of our respondents said that they're feeling fearful, whereas only 14% said they're feeling motivated. There's several other kind of adjectives that describe their feeling as well in and around that, both positive and negative. But these two numbers and the stark difference in that in their order of magnitude, so to speak, spoke to us. Okay, let me show you some additional detail on this data. So number one, again, what is the top barrier in life sciences? And the first one is politicization of scientific topics. So 40% said this, or 39% said this. This was a 15% increase from the January number. So it's significant. Economy headed into recession. 32% said this. Also an 11% change from January. And then finally, it's the instability of the job market or employment challenges. So none of these are structural. These are all sort of externalities that are facing scientists in their ability to do their work. So this is really a critical shift in how science is being seen. We've never seen numbers like this before, as far as not being about the science itself. Okay, so as I mentioned, 50% are anticipating that trust in science is going to continue to decrease in 2025. They gave us some really good quotes and some verbatims to give us some texture on this. For example, one person said, "Science, especially vaccines, is being politicized and systematically destroyed by the U.S. political leadership." Another person said, "Government officials and popular media outlets will continue to increase criticism of scientists and universities." And then finally, the lack of funding and current government's anti-science policies will make it harder to explain our scientific research to average Americans. This wasn't just an academic issue. In the next slide, you'll see that there's also some sentiment from our biopharma respondents as well. So I won't read the two quotes from academics because we just heard from academics, but this is an interesting one because it actually underlines an issue that they believe is inherent in science as well. This person said, "Due to the ongoing misinformation and high-profile reproducibility issues, public confidence in scientific findings may continue to decline slightly." So did you hear how sort of drastic the prior statements were and how measured this one was? I think this is a really key theme that we saw over and over again in the responses that we're being hearing. Whereas academia is really mired and so connected because that's where their funding is coming from by and large. Biopharma is being much more pragmatic, staying stable and moving forward. And we'll share with you a little bit more details on that. So what information are they trusting? Where are they going for their sources of information? Not at all surprisingly, 79% of our respondents said scientific publications. So peer-reviewed scientific publications still stay the gold standard for the truth and for information. Despite the reproducibility issues, we see this over and over again. And that's followed by 69% of the people said that people in their own professional network. This is actually something to underline because professional networks and societies and the ability for a group of people to come in and validate each other and spend time with each other we believe is going to become even more prominent in the next few years as AI starts to create sort of synthetic content. And then 55% of the people said colleagues in my own organization. So we're just talking to each other. Unfortunately, that also has the potential side effect of making organizations too insular, but that's essentially those are the areas where people say that they trust. Let's talk about the people where they least trust. So no surprise, elected government officials, 2% of the people said that they trust them. 4% said that they trust appointed government representatives, and then 5% said that they trust mainstream media and reporters. So essentially, 95% said that they don't really trust them. All right, so this is interesting because again, we asked them, how should scientists respond to this? You know, do we actually as a community have a role here? So again, as I mentioned before, 57% said yes, please, somebody needs to talk and increase communications with the general public. And also 45% actually said that they really want to have an opportunity to engage with political leaders and policymakers, that they actually believe that science actually has a, you know, continues to play a role here. But, you know, in pharma in pharma and biotech, there are some pretty powerful organizations, bio, pharma. Those are both organizations that actually reach, you know, lawmakers and policymakers, as well as people who are regulators. We don't have that in the general sciences as much. There's organizations like the AAAS, which you know connect with Congress and so on, but they haven't really, as far as we know, they haven't really sort of stood up with a stance on where science belongs in this global situation. Okay, so we mentioned this before. There's 28% of the people, when we asked, how do you feel about the state of science in 2025? 28% said fearful, and that's really sad. Like, let's just take a moment and recognize that 28% of your customers are just scared, right? They're just scared. And that's a terrible, terrible feeling. So I think that can go a long way toward having empathy for them. 14% said that they're motivated. And that's really exciting. Now, again, not surprisingly, the fear sentiment is actually much more weighted for, you know, in academia than it is in biopharma. The biopharma people are being much more pragmatic and moving forward. Excellent. So now we're going to take a deep dive into the economic outlook. But before we go there, there's a couple of questions. So Mark asked, are these numbers the same for EMEA and North America? Actually, no. What we saw is they were most prominent in North America. They were middling in Europe, and Asia Pacific was the least. But the trend was all the same. It was just the magnitude was different in each of them, Mark. So there's absolutely that trend is global. So what we're facing. And then Diana asks, regarding the data on scientists feeling fearful or not, is that US only? I think I just mentioned that no, that is actually a global statement, but there was a big difference between academics versus biopharma. Okay, now let's talk about their economic outlook, and please keep the questions coming.
Great. So as Hamid had mentioned, many scientists are kind of hesitant about the economic outcomes. There's as Hamid had mentioned, there was the kind of the expectation, and then there's the reality. And so there's a little bit of a difference here. But by and large, many are kind of expecting some form of recession in the later half of 2025. And this is especially prominent within the academic market, because many of them see their kind of funding tied to the economy. And so this is the kind of the environment that the academic community is living within. I had just mentioned, but many people, about 70% of people, are expecting some form of recession coming in the second half of 2025. Specifically, when we're looking at academic and biopharma, we're seeing the same sort of trend. There's a sensitivity and an alarm within the academic community as they're talking about some of their budgets. About 2 times as many academics are expecting their budgets to decrease in comparison to the biopharma folks. Hamid had mentioned this a little bit earlier, but sequencing tools are definitely the top technology that scientists are looking to purchase in the remainder of the year. This, as Hamid had mentioned, was really driven by multi-omics, spatial, proteomics, those types of technologies. People are looking to purchase them, looking to adopt them, and trying to collect new forms of data through these technologies. And then when we're looking at purchasing, as we had mentioned, there was the kind of expectation versus the reality. About 60% are expecting to maintain a steady or potentially increased amount of purchasing of many of the everyday lab products. And so, although there is this hesitation, there's this concern, maybe even fear within the community, many people are continuing to maintain that status quo of some of the purchasing habits that they already have. And so we want to dig in a little bit more into what this 71% looks like that are expecting this recession. And so what that looks like is when we had asked on a 5-point scale from deep recession to significant growth in the later half of 2025. We're seeing between mild and deep recession, 71% are expecting that recession. But the majority of people, about half of the sample, are actually expecting some sort of mild recession. And so when we dig into this a little bit more, we're seeing some differences geographically, we're seeing some differences across the different segments of academia and biopharma. But for the most part, people are taking a little bit more of a pessimistic approach on the economy. Before we move too far ahead into the differences that are currently happening, we wanted to take a look backward to see what the trend is looking like. And so when we look back, the end or the midpoint of 2024 and the beginning of 2025 were relatively flat. People were a little bit more leaning toward recession, but by and large, it was a pretty even split between recession and growth. However, this tune has significantly changed come the mid-year of 2025, and many more people are taking more of a recessionary view on the economy. I had mentioned this before, but there definitely were differences between academia and biopharma. And so when we're looking here, we're seeing that academics are much more expecting a recession, specifically a deep recession. So we're seeing that academics, about 25% of those were looking at that deep recession, and that's what they're expecting. Whereas biopharma was almost half as likely to have that sentiment. Both had about similar levels of mild recession, but the academics were taking a much more severe pessimistic approach with their economic outlooks. And when we zoom out a little bit and look a little bit more globally, we're seeing similar trends. People are typically leaning a little bit more toward recession as opposed to growth, but this was especially heightened within North America. When we look at the extreme, the deep recession, almost a quarter of North America respondents were expecting some sort of deep recession in comparison to about 15% in Europe and about less than 10% in Asia Pacific. So the North America community is definitely in a little bit more of that deeper, kind of a little bit more concerned economic opinion. But in terms of the mild recession, there were pretty similar numbers, about half, 46 to 51% across all of the different geographies. But when we're looking at the flip side of the growth, the Asia Pacific markets actually had the most significant numbers when we're looking at significant growth for the remainder of the year. So that portion was a little bit more on that optimistic, a little bit more on that significant optimism when they were looking about the second half of the year. And so when we were asking what were some of the primary trends or maybe the different news sources that people were taking this approach, biopharma and academia actually had similar attributions, and they were discussing the change in the government priorities and the federal administration as the kind of primary reason for their opinion on the economy. And we took the sample and split it up into different kind of viewpoints. So looking at those that had expected some sort of recession, looking at those that were expecting not a lot of change, and then looking at those that were taking a little bit more of that growth outlook. And so what we're seeing is when they're looking at the different types of priorities and technologies that they're looking to adopt, those within the recession outlook were expecting or hoping to take more of an approach of automating. And this was the similar trend across all three of these different groups, but automating their protocols, automating their workflows was definitely a priority as they were thinking about some of their purchases. However, the difference here is how they're going about doing that and the approach that they're taking to trying to automate some of these workflows. So those with more of a recession outlook are trying to delay some of their purchases. They're kind of pausing, they're waiting, they're seeing how the remainder of the year looks before going ahead with some of these additional purchases. Those on the other camps the no significant change and a little bit more of that growth outlook, those people are a little bit more willing to kind of pull the trigger now before any of the funding changes. So they're looking to make these automation tools and make these adoptions sooner than later, before there were any additional changes in the market or any other kind of budget adjustments.
Jared, before we move on from here, there's several questions that I think are more or less being answered right here. Joan asks, well, Joan had two questions. One about kind of where expenditure is happening, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, Joan. But she also asked, what's happening as far as are people delaying? And you can see here who is delaying and who is not. It depends on their outlook and where they're thinking about that. We have some more detailed data on here that we're not sharing at a high level, but we absolutely have it that really puts this into place. And then let's see who it was that was asking. Oh, Sham was asking, do we know what type of funding that they're looking for when they're applying to these new sources of funding? And we do have some information on that. We actually did a report as well back when the NIH funding cuts were first announced, and people were looking for either other private philanthropic funding sources. There's a huge movement toward seeking funding there, as well as industries. And so scientists are trying to, diversify their funding portfolio and not being wholly focused on government funding sources. And the question that we are actually asking is what's going to happen on the back end of that handshake where, if more of the funding is privately driven, then will the information also be privately kept, or whether it's going to be, still withholding that part of the equation, which is to share the information publicly. So we don't know about that yet. Jared, let's keep going.
Okay. Thank you, Hamid.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking a little bit about some of the purchasing, we were asking about their expectations for the purchasing. And so we're looking across the different geographies here. We're seeing that organizations in North America are a little bit more limited in their purchase expectations for both the kind of consumables and reagents, but also the instruments themselves. Whereas Asia Pacific, like I had mentioned a little bit before, they were a little bit more in the kind of significant growth mindset. That percentage was a little bit higher than some of the other geographies. And this mirrors that as well, as they're kind of a little bit less, taking a little bit less of a pessimistic view, and they're more willing to kind of continue with some of that purchasing of the consumables and those instruments. And so when we were digging in a little bit more, we were seeing that the expected cost increases were some of the contributing factors, along with some of these funding concerns. So about 40% of those scientists were expecting kind of decreased purchasing, and many of them, the majority, about 70%, were citing lowered funding as that reason. So the cutting in funding is leading to some of the cuts with some of the purchasing. And then when we were looking at some of the potential increases in some of that growth, about 30% of scientists were saying that they were expecting to increase purchasing, and that was due to increases in kind of new studies or new data that they were hoping to collect. So the beginning of new kind of initiatives was driving that increase. And so when we're looking at the differences in funding, Hamid had talked a little bit about this, but some of the expectations here, the US scientists in biopharma are significantly less likely to experiencing any of those funding decreases. So Hamid had mentioned they're kind of taking a little bit more of that pragmatic approach. They're a little bit more kind of optimistic and maybe a little bit less concerned around some of the funding. And this definitely mirrors that. When we were looking kind of longitudinally to the beginning half of this year, this is a 17-point difference. So people are within academia that they were saying that the funding would actually be decreasing. And so this is a 17-point difference. So the academia market is actually becoming more concerned around some of that funding, and pharma is as well, but not necessarily taking it to the same extreme as academia. And then when we were talking about some of the expected budget differences and some of that funding differences, we're seeing that academia is expecting about a 20% cut in some of their budgets. This is about 2 times that of biopharma. So this is a pretty big jump from where we were at the beginning part of this year. So this is about a 10-point difference within academia compared to the beginning half of this year. And so we want to dig into that a little bit more. So we were looking at kind of the change in purchasing of some of those everyday lab products. And so at an overall level, we're seeing that there has been a little bit of a shift. So we're seeing that green bar, a little bit higher numbers on the left side of this chart. So whether that's significant decrease, somewhat, or maybe slight decrease, there is a little bit of a decrease here. Staying the same is a little bit lower as well. So we're seeing a little bit of the shift to that left side of this chart currently. Whereas in the past, this past January and last July, things were relatively steady. We're starting to see that shift in the current market. And we wanted to dig into this a little bit more to continue to highlight the differences between biopharma and academia. By and large, biopharma is really not seeing major differences within the everyday purchases. They're seeing things that are pretty consistent across the last three halves. We're seeing similar numbers in terms of kind of staying the same, about half there, 42% are expecting things to somewhat stay the same. And similar people, a similar kind of bell curve on either side. But the difference really is in academia. So unsurprisingly, the decline in some of these everyday purchases, about 50% of academia is expecting some form of decreased purchasing. So this is up about 32 points from the beginning of the year. And this really does demonstrate some of the concerns that academia is having around the decreases in funding, decreases in purchasing, taking a little bit more of that alarmed and potentially pessimistic view for the remainder of 2025. And one of the questions that we were asking is the expectations versus the reality. Hamid had mentioned this at the beginning, and we're seeing a pretty big delta here between what is expected and the perception of what is kind of happening in the future versus what is actually happening. So when we're looking here, we're seeing that almost 80% of these budgetary concerns are based on expectations. So the top portion of this chart is people that were saying that their expected budget is to kind of increase. Many are saying that they're going to be staying the same or potentially even decrease. But then the bottom portion here is talking about the budgets that have actually changed. So this is saying what actually is happening to your budget. And so about, let's say, 20%, give or take, of the sample is saying that the budgets have actually changed. But that means that many of these expectations are just that, they're expectations. They're not necessarily rooted in actual changes to their budgets and funding. And when we're looking a little bit more longitudinally, we had asked about purchasing kind of new technologies, a binary question. Are you going to purchase or are you not? And when we're looking across the board, we're seeing that the kind of plan for purchasing is actually going down. There was a little bit of a spike in 2023, the beginning of that year. But ever since then, there's been a little bit of a decline. And so we're seeing, and this is actually the lowest that it has ever been, but we're seeing a similar trend between 2024 and 2025, despite the kind of highs that were at once in 2023.
There's one question that I want to address. Sarah asks, how many people actually know what their budgets are going to be like a year out, right? And I think it's a really salient question. Does that 21% represent anybody who knows their budgets already? So just to clarify, Sarah, we actually asked about the remainder of 2025. So we're already halfway through 2025. And so that 21% or so has actually received guidance on their budgets, but everyone else is like just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And when we dug deeper, as Jared said, it's not really based on any concrete evidence other than just what they're hearing in the news. And maybe their colleagues have, I mean, we've all heard of grants getting canceled, and also the cap on indirect costs. So those are actually tangible, and so not to be dismissed. But there is just this shroud over your customers right now. I hope that was helpful.
And we had mentioned this a little bit before, but in terms of the new technologies that were kind of being intended on purchasing, so kind of what was top of mind, back in June of 2024, sequencing tools was the top one. That kind of has remained within the top priorities across the board for the last three halves, and it remains as the number one ranked tool for intended purchase in the July of 2025. The other one that we had mentioned was AI. So this often is a huge point that people were starting to think about, and the machine learning, generative AI, bioinformatics, all of those were interesting to many different people. And AI continues to be within the top one or two ranked technologies that people are intending to purchase as they're kind of continuing to think about where they want to allocate their different budgets.
Also, Jen, thank you for pointing that out. That should say January 2025 in the middle column, not 24. So it actually is sequential from a timing perspective. So this looks like a year ago, and then half a year ago, and now. So thank you for that.
And so we want to think a little bit about the remainder of 2025. We've talked a little bit about some of the economic expectations, the difference in perception versus reality, but we want to dig in a little bit more as to what the remainder of this year will look like. And so when we're looking at both the academic and the biopharma, people are continuing to explore AI and new collaborations. The topic of automation we had touched on, AI definitely plays a role within that. And then when we're looking at the different collaborations, that was Hamid had mentioned, was talking a little bit about some of the securing additional funding. So finding ways that they can collaborate, potentially find additional funds, continue to carry on their science. But when we're looking at each of these segments, we're seeing that the needs of success between both of these different segments are a little bit different. And so we need to make sure that we're remaining nuanced as we're communicating to each of these different audiences as their priorities are somewhat different. I had mentioned this a little bit ago, but talking about some of these collaborations, this definitely is a top priority for us. And so this was one that had shifted from January to now. In January, this was the third kind of priority, and now this is the number one priority. Unsurprisingly, machine learning and generative AI remain one of the most impactful techniques, and many people are trying to find different ways to incorporate AI into their different workflows and find ways for furthering automation. But the generative AI piece was definitely the big one. We had
Actually,
talked.
there was a question slash comment. Mark says, what are we defining as AI? And then also, many vendors try to put an AI spin to their product. Is this mainly drug discovery or a tool being used with AI? So first of all, we actually have a couple of definitions that we put in there, like machine learning and generative AI for predictive modeling. That's one. That was one category, Mark. The other category was AI assisted bioinformatics and data processing. And so those are the two categories. So this is not like, oh yeah, you bought this new HPLC system and there's an AI genie that can help you optimize your methods. That's not that. I don't think that actually belongs in these data sets. Now, where there's a third category of AI actually that's neither of these things is actually AI that helps drive sort of business problems forward. We have a client who has created an AI auto IND submission dossier. So it'll get you the first draft of an IND based on the data in a day versus in months. That is a legitimate use of AI in pharma and biopharma, but it has nothing to do with drug discovery or any kind of research or development. So we're actually talking about bringing AI in to solve these novel problems. That's the definition.
And I think that that's actually a perfect segue into the next slide here, was just kind of
There
thinking
you go.
about these different techniques. So as Hamid had mentioned, the machine learning enabled kind of predictive modeling, the generative AI piece, that was number one, followed closely by these machine learning bioinformatics capabilities. So finding ways to incorporate AI through both the generative AI, but also within the bioinformatics. These have remained somewhat steady since the beginning of the year and remain as the top techniques. But so these are also followed by kind of personalized therapeutics, multi-omics, CRISPR, and organoids were also within the top 5. And so as we're thinking about kind of adopting these AI tools and acquiring new forms of data, these were the key priorities for many of the academics and the biopharma. But they definitely are taking a little bit of that back seat for collaborations. And finding new collaborations, external partners, continuing to kind of increase this knowledge. And one of the things that Hamid had mentioned a little bit earlier was the trustworthy sources, whether that's kind of those within my network, those within my organization. So finding ways to collaborate both internally within organizations and externally are continuing to be a top priority. And this is a little bit of a jump. So this last at the beginning of the year was the 3rd priority, and now this has jumped up to the 1st place spot. And so when we dig into this a little bit more, we're asking kind of for what purposes are you trying to find these collaborations? And just over 50% are talking about kind of securing additional forms of funding. So trying to find ways to continue to diversify the funding for these different scientists. We also wanted to dig in a little bit about productivity and think about what the future of productivity looks like, what that expectations are there. And so we're seeing that academia is expecting a little bit of a lower priority compared to biopharma. This difference is continuing with the thread of funding and purchasing and the ways that people are taking the economic outlook. So biopharma is a little bit more of an optimist, whereas academia is taking a little bit more of that pessimistic view. And as we're thinking about this productivity, we're thinking about different ways to potentially outsource different things or bring them in-house and how people are differing here. But about 50% of both academia and biopharma are planning to outsource these routine assays. So this is about a 6-point jump since the beginning of the year, and people are really trying to do this to find ways to cut some of those costs and be a little bit more efficient with some of their spend. When we're looking at academia specifically, they're thinking about bringing that primary research and target identification in-house. That was a priority for them when they were kind of thinking about what they wanted to do internally. And then biopharma was really looking at outsourcing the clinical trial design. This was the big one for them, that they wanted to continue to find partnerships externally to allow those to be done outsourced. In consumer confidence, this was a big one. About 50% of scientists are expecting to kind of meet their targets. So we had asked around the kind of highly confident, very highly confident, or certain, and this was a bit of a differing point between academia and biopharma. So there was actually a 21-point difference between those two segments, with biopharma being a little bit more optimistic in terms of their confidence of meeting their productivity marks. But the way that they're defining these are a little bit different. So the way that we're going to have to message to them and speak to them is different, and we'll dig into that a little bit more in a couple slides. So we also looked longitudinally. And so what we're seeing is similar trends to before. Looking overall, we're seeing that at the beginning of 2024, this is where people were kind of feeling the most confident in meeting their productivity marks. And ever since then, there's been a somewhat of a decline. It was somewhat flat between the middle of 2024 and the beginning of 2025, but there's been a pretty big drop since the beginning of this year. So that sentiment is slowly starting to decline. But there are some differences here in biopharma. So biopharma actually has taken a little bit of a different approach to the overall market. They're seeing a little bit higher numbers in terms of that productivity. So they're continuing to kind of maintain that status quo. Um, Although there was a little bit of a dip compared to the beginning of this year, this is not too different from where we were this time last year. So there's very few differences from about a year ago. And so I had mentioned a little bit before about the differing ways of people thinking about their productivity and how they're defining those. And so this is where we can kind of see that. And academia is kind of the confidence in their productivity and kind of hitting those marks has decreased since the beginning of the year. This is a pretty big drop, about a 14-point difference from the beginning of the year. And the way that they think about productivity is around the number of publications that they're putting out, the funding that's being received, and then the impact of those publications. And so the publications have remained somewhat consistent from the beginning of this year, but the funding and the impact of some of those publications have all jumped a couple of points. And then for biopharma, this is where we see that a little bit higher level of confidence around some of the productivity. And the way that biopharma is thinking about productivity is meeting the kind of production and commercialization milestones. This is a little bit of a decline, but pretty flat compared to the beginning of this year. They're also thinking about the number of projects that they have completed and meeting some of those regulatory milestones. And then kind of thinking about the next steps and kind of comparing the last 12 months to the coming 6 months, what will the next 6 months kind of look like? And academia is definitely starting to kind of expect that lower productivity in comparison to biopharma. So biopharma, about 50% of people are expecting to maintain that status quo, not many changes there. Whereas academia is expecting a little bit more of that decline. So a little bit over 30% are expecting lower levels of productivity. And this is, as I had mentioned before, a little bit of an increase. So they're a little bit less optimistic about meeting those milestones in the comparison to the beginning of this year. So I'll pass it back to Hamid with kind of final thoughts and bringing us home.
Yeah, thank you. So before doing that, because I'm only going to talk for about 5 minutes about that, there are some questions I want to address. So thank you, Eric. The question was whether, what really comprises sequencing tools? Is it LCMS for proteomics? And typically, no. I think generally again, in the more detailed data, we believe that it's more DNA and RNA sequencing. If there's some sort of a DNA sequencing technique that uses mass spectrometry. I don't think that people were really that aware of that, but it's not really for proteomics, we don't believe. So that's the answer to that question. And then another great question from Sahil was about, he was actually making note of the stockpiling and the supply chain issues that happened as we were coming out of the COVID lockdown. And he was wondering whether that's something that happened. In fact, it's very astute of you to ask that question. So two places where we see that. In our January survey, there was actually an intention that people were accelerating their expenditure because they were anticipating that maybe budgets were going to get cut. So they were accelerating. And many of the clients that we talked to, they said that they maybe even overshot their Q1 revenue goals. And so that jives with the fact that there was this acceleration. There was a good number of people who actually said that they were going to accelerate expenditure now in anticipation of maybe some budgets getting cut. But they were in the minority. They were the people who were not anticipating that that a recession was going to come. Remember how the things that they were going to do was differing based on their recessionary outlook. And that middle pile actually was thinking, okay, things aren't as bad right now, but I'm going to accelerate my expenditure. So we would assume a little bit of that, Sahil, but I don't think there's going to be anything that would create supply chain issues. So that was that question. And then Richard asks, for those who expect to purchase fewer consumables, is it because is it driven by budget or expenditures, or from fewer tests and less laboratory work taking place? It's probably a combination of both, but more the former than the latter. I think most of the people who were responding to that question, Richard, were actually saying, I don't have the money to actually do the things that I need to do, and so I'm going to do less of them, and I'm going to reprioritize things that I'm doing. But a small portion of that is actually driven to a move toward in silico types of research and in silico types of development. So it's probably a combination of both. To be honest with you, we don't have the data to tease that out, but those are the things that we sensed in our market. Let's see, another question. So, is there some selection bias based on data? Alex, I can never say that there's never a selection bias in any data set. Yeah, absolutely, that there is. However, he goes on to ask, because these are the people who actually have jobs. And so, are there rounds of layoff that are actually showing a maybe a more grim picture of biopharma? And so the people who still have jobs are feeling pretty optimistic about it. Again, I cannot deny that, but I don't have any data to actually prove it or to tell you what that bias is. However, we do actually ask people who have been laid off recently to identify that they've been laid off, and we actually ask them as well. So there's some voice that's outside of the people who've sort of, withstood the rounds of layoff. And so this may actually be a little bit of a more holistic look into the economy than what that your suggested selection bias would suggest. Let's see, lots of other questions. Um, okay, so Joan asks, how can suppliers and service providers support academic labs facing potential productivity declines? Are there opportunities to deliver more flexible solutions, automation, and collaborative tools to help mitigate the anticipated slowdowns? Joan, this is a perfect segue into our next section. And all of the things that you said, absolutely, all the things. And more specifically, what our customers are asking for, and also what stance we at Linus believe you as providers should and can take in moving forward. So let's actually wrap this up with our final thoughts in just the next few minutes and go from there. So essentially, you saw that there's been this move that we've been tracking for several years, where they've gone through automating manual processes and now moving that automation integration into AI enablement. 60% see predictive modeling, either generative AI or AI-enabled bioinformatics, as the most impactful technology in 2025. But that's not where they're spending their money. They're actually, yes, they're spending their money there, but they're spending more money in actually acquiring novel data through sequencing technologies and other technologies. So sequencing wasn't the only thing that came up either. There's a long list of things that they're planning on spending money on. But and they're still trying to spend money on automation. So this is your roadmap, Joan and friends, for how to support these scientists who are basically moving to change the fundamentals and the infrastructure of how they're doing their work. So that's essentially what's happening. And again, on the funding front, there needs to be an addressing of this politicization of science, where building trust. Again, 57% said we need somebody to please stand up and share what we're doing and do more general public communications. And then securing funding is the other side, where 42% are looking for new collaborations and 53% are prioritizing new sources of funding. So we don't think of this term when we think of academics, but this is what consolidation sounds like. Right? So when all of the life science tools companies started consolidating, that's what happened to companies like us, our Linus. And so this is actually what's happening. This is actually the beginnings of academic research consolidation. And once they consolidate, they will have bigger voice, they'll have bigger power, and they will have bigger budgets, but they'll also have bigger power in the negotiating table. So we actually see that this is happening on that side. But the building of the trust, that is now, because everyone is going through this, because this is the state and the norm of globally what's happening in the science, there is a wide open field for new leaders to emerge here, and you do it through thought leadership. So again, what's really driving this model is just speculation oh my goodness, the sky is falling, recession is happening, beginning of the year. I mean, look, everything is down. I don't disagree, and our numbers show that. But there's sort of an overestimation of this because there's so many availabilities of story. There's a heuristic called availability. If you can think of a story of something happening, you will overestimate how often it happens by up to 10 times. So if there's been a recent shark attack and you go and survey people, how often do shark attacks happen? They will overestimate by about 10 times. This is the thing that's driving the second half of the year. You have the ability to combat that by basically taking them out of their media consumption and bringing them back to their terrestrial reality and trying to figure out how they can move forward in meeting their goals. The budget cuts are more expected than real. And then also several people, especially in academia, are in a holding pattern. So again, that is a behavioral issue that commercial teams can address if that's where you choose to go. That's the last slide. I know we're coming up to the top of our hour. So increasing communication, I think, is really important. But we don't mean send them more like proposition emails. We mean increase communication on behalf of science. And then just really believe, and some people believe that their vendors and their suppliers actually have a voice in this and they have a power in this. And so let's actually stand up. What was really interesting is that as much as people wanted somebody to speak up, they themselves don't believe that they're the ones that are going to speak up. So only 11% believe that their labs or US labs are going to increase their communication with the public. So here's a call out to everybody who's listening to this. Who is going to speak up? Who's responsible for this? Because we all are, but that also means that somebody needs to. And so let's try to figure this out as an industry on behalf of science. Okay, I will pause right here. This is the end. That's our story. Thank you for joining us. Just one mention of this. We have a full report. We have a slide deck with 70 more slides in the appendix, as well as the data set that we are offering to you. And we'll send you an email with the link as soon as that's ready. So we believe that it's going to be ready by the end of the day, where you can go and acquire and take a deep dive into the data in hopes that it'll help you. The opportunities are there. Don't take this as oh my gosh, the world is ending. But it's not easy, and so you're really gonna be required to innovate. And so we're very much looking forward to watching and helping whenever we can. Thank you everyone for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the rest of July. Talk to you soon.